Welcome to episode 195 of the Z-Blog Power Hour. I am the host and sole proprietor of the Z-Blog, which can be found at thezman.com. Before I get started, a friendly reminder that you can support my work with more than just your enthusiasm. Listener enthusiasm is not accepted at the bank, so if you like what you hear, consider kicking in a few bucks to the cause. Information on how to do that is on the site. Just look for the donation button at the top. A quick plug for our friends at Alaska Chaga, Minter and Richter, and Have a Mile Soapworks. Thank you all for supporting the community. All right. Well, this week I'm doing something completely different. It's a show about a book. And it's not a book that most people would probably recognize. I don't know, but maybe people my age will probably recognize it. But I haven't really done a show about a book before. I mean, I think the closest I've ever gotten to this is the show I did on libertarianism, where I used Hans Hermann Hope's book, The Democracy, the God That Failed. I also did a show on fascism, which I relied upon Paul Gottfried's book, because it's a really good book to use for a podcast on fascism. It's just perfectly laid out. It's very short. But in both of those cases, the show wasn't really about the book. It was about the topic, and the book was really just an adjunct to it. It was a tool I was using. In this show, the book and the man who wrote the book, well, they're the central figures. And this is a book that I was given when I was a teenager, and that means that it's made of wood, and the pages are all vellum. I mean, it is old. I mean, it's probably one of the oldest books I own. So 1980, something like that. Somewhere in the 80s I got it. So you're looking at, it's a long time ago. And the book is The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. He was a legendary swordsman and warrior in 17th century Japan. And he wrote this book after he reached a point where he really couldn't fight with real weapons anymore because he was impossible to defeat. So when he would face off against someone in a challenge, it would just mean the death of his opponent. So there came a point, and there was an interesting story in the preview of the book in which he fought this young guy who was this great warrior, had this interesting style. And Musashi jumps out of the boat, because he had to row this boat to this little island where he was. He jumps out of the boat, rushes up to the guy with just a wooden sword, and kills him. Knocks him over the head and kills him. And from that point forward, he wasn't going to use any real weapons anymore because he didn't want to keep killing his opponents. So at the point he reached, his sort of maximal fame, he goes off into a cave, and you can actually visit this cave today. It still exists, and his where he's buried, I guess, or his ashes are buried. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but it's still there. And he wrote out his philosophy of fighting and his philosophy of living. And here's the opening of the book. I have been many years training in the way of strategy, and now I think I will explain it in writing for the first time. It is now during the first 10 days of the 10th month in the 20th year of Kanai, which is 1645. I have climbed Mountain Iwatu of Higo in Kyushu to pay homage to heaven, pray to Kwannon, and kneel before Buddha. I am a warrior of Harima Province, Shinmen Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Geshen, age 60 years. From youth, my heart has been inclined towards the way of strategy. My first duel was when I was 13. I struck down a strategist of the Shinto school, one Arima Kihei. When I was 16, I struck down an able strategist, Tadashima Akayama. When I was 21, I went up to the capital and met all manner of strategists, never once failing to win in many contests. After that, I went from province to province, dueling with strategists of various schools, and not once failed to win, even though I had as many as 60 encounters. This was between the ages of 13 and 28 or 29. When I reached 30, I looked back on my past. The previous victories were not due to my having mastered strategy. Perhaps it was natural ability, or the order of heaven, or that other school strategy was inferior. After that, I studied morning and evening, searching for the principle, and came to realize the way of strategy when I was 50. Now, this is, I think, that last part is one thing that kind of strikes me, being in this part of my timeline, is that it's true. There is a point in which you realize that you haven't actually been living an ordered life. You've just been living. And you've been living on energy and youthful enthusiasm and dumb luck. At a certain point, you realize that, wait a second, there's has to be some order to my life, some point. I have to go towards some destination. And this is a part of this particular passage it strikes me today, but when I read the book back then, it didn't make any sense to me. And it's one of those things that back in the 1980s, this was very popular. American businessmen were reading it because they heard that Japanese businessmen were reading it. Japanese businessmen were kicking everybody's ass around the world. Everyone wanted to know how it was these guys were doing this. So this book became very popular. Reading that back then, of course, I was a young guy. People were, this was what people were into, particularly sort of right-wing-ish, pro-business type people, conservatives of the age. And so when I read it, that section didn't really mean anything to me. But over the years, I've often picked this book up. It's a strange thing. I've picked it up many times. It's very short, so you can kind of look, thumb through it. And it's one of those things where I wind up, my finger falls on a section, and I realize, hey, you know what? That's something that I can actually use in my life and think about. It's not great philosophy. It's just good reminders about the things that you already kind of know. And that last section I just read about, when he turned 30, he realized that, he was not living his life by a strategy. He was just kind of going through life and living by accident. And he spent the next 20 years trying to figure it out. Well, that's something I think a lot of middle-aged men can kind of come to terms with. There's a weird point that you hit somewhere in your 40s maybe, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, in that range, where all of a sudden you acquire wisdom and you don't really know what the hell happened. You're just smarter. You just know things. It's one of those things after 500 years, that's a passage that resonates with probably anyone over the age of 40, I'm guessing. So what this show is this week is I'm going to go through each chapter of the book. It's 5 chapters, hence the Book of 5 Rings. I'm going to go through each one of these chapters and read certain sections of it and talk about what it's supposed to mean and also talk about what it may mean to us, not just as dissidents, because politics obviously is what this show is generally about, but also what it means to us as people, just as normal people. So let's get started. The first book in the Book of 5 Rings is called the Ground Book, or sometimes it's called the Earth Book. Usually it's the Ground Book, and in my copy it is the Ground Book, although I've looked at reviews and write-ups, and lots of people have talked about this over the years, and sometimes it's the Earth Book. I'm not really sure why that is. I don't really know anything about the Japanese language, so it could very well be some ambiguity there. After all, this book was written in the 17th century, so there could be changes over time, but it doesn't matter. Ground probably works better, and probably most people prefer that word because this first chapter is sort of the foundation. It's what the rest of the book is built on, and it's supposed to emphasize this idea that you can't just learn things. They have to be a part of a general strategy. And by strategy, sort of a philosophical outlook on life, how one engages life. Your strategy has how you're going to live. And it's beyond just, hey, I have strategy in fighting. It's how one prepares and how one lives when they're not fighting and all the other stuff. So strategy, in a sense, is much more sort of a philosophy. And the book opens up with this line: strategy is the craft of the warrior. Commanders must enact a craft, and troopers should know this way. And again, we're going to see this term craft come up a lot, particularly in the first book, because fighting as a warrior is looked at as a craft, and you acquire a craft, the skills of a craftsman, not just by learning those narrow things, but by the way in which your life is organized. And he goes in, to set this up and describes the sort of 4 ways of a gentleman. And ways in this context means sort of the philosophy, the nature of, the way as in capitalized is, the nature of the universe, the nature of human society and humans in it and all that stuff. So the first is the farmer, and his life is focused on the changing of the seasons. That's what his life is about. And then you have the merchant, whose life is about making profit. The warrior, he has to master his weapons. That's his primary way of life. And then finally, you have the carpenter, who's proficient in his tools, he's careful in his plans, and he performs his work according to that plan. These things are aspects of what a gentleman is going to be, the ways of a gentleman. And of course, there's a special emphasis on the carpenter, and that comes back often in this book. And there's a famous quote that turns up anytime someone talks about Musashi, and it goes like this: know the smallest things and the biggest things, the shallowest things and the deepest things. As if it were a straight road mapped out on the ground, these things cannot be explained in detail. For one thing, know 10,000 things. When you attain the way of strategy, there will not be one thing you cannot see. You must study hard. Now, this is one of those things that is attractive to Westerners, and irritating to Westerners. This style of writing, this juxtaposition, learn the shallowest things and the deepest things, this sort of back and forth comparison. And what it's intended to, and again, it's attractive to people who are into mysticism and it's trying to sound cool, but the idea is that, don't just focus on these certain items. You have to focus on all things. You have to be comprehensive in your knowledge. And again, it sounds a bit mystical, but later in this book, and it's not a really long chapter. Chapter is probably the right way to think of it, but they're called books. And later on in the book, he lists these sort of principles, his list of principles that are the foundation of what he calls strategy, or again, what we would call a philosophy or an approach to life. And here they are. And it kind of fills out that previous quote, it helps it make a little bit more sense. So here's number 1. Think in honest and direct terms. Number 2, forge yourself in the way. Number 3, touch upon all the arts. Number 4, know the ways of all occupations. Number 5, know the advantages and disadvantages of everything. Number 6, develop a discerning eye in all matters. Number 7, understand what cannot be seen by the eye. Number 8, pay attention even to small things. And number 9, do not involve yourself in the impractical. Now, I've always liked that last one. It always resonates with me. But you can see what he's building up here is there this outlook in life that to be successful, in his case, there's a duality here. He's teaching his style of being a warrior, his fighting technique, but it's also drawn to be sort of a philosophy of life. And of course, it applies to other areas. I mentioned at the beginning that Japanese businessmen read this book. It became very popular in the 1980s in the United States because Japanese businessmen were reading this book, and it was thought, aha, this will tell us something about how the Japanese compete in the business world. And you could see right away that competition is really just one aspect. It's a manifestation of a whole sort of strategy of life. You as a competitor, whether it's in business or swordplay or warrior or whatever it might be, well, you've got to shape your mind, shape your outlook, your philosophy of life, and it's not just going to apply to the things that you do in your work if you're a businessman or you're a soldier or whatever. It's going to apply everywhere. So it's a habit of mind. You train yourself. So the idea of being, think in honest terms, well, if you deceive yourself and you overestimate your skills or you overestimate the possibility of success, and things like that, you're going to fail a lot. Forge yourself in the way, which means accept the nature of the world. Don't resist the realities that you face. Being honest with yourself is also being honest with the world around you. Being a well-rounded person, knowing all these different things. Taking advantage of something also means it comes with disadvantages. There's a lot of wisdom here that it says that you've got to be someone who's prudent. First of all, and because prudence means that you have taken the time to consider all the possibilities. You're not rushing into things. You're not, just jumping ahead and hoping for the best. You're someone who, understands the value of pace and taking your time and timing and things like that. And of course, there's a reason why this book was popular. I don't know if it's still popular. Japan was much more ascendant in the 1980s, and businessmen were much more saw themselves as the modern warriors, but things have changed. But there's still a lot here that applies to the current age. In your personal life, understanding yourself and your role in life, well, that's a very important thing. A lot of people do walk around kind of deluded as to not only who they are, but what it is they're doing. Their life has no purpose. They just kind of go from one thing to the next. We talk about bugmen, for example. Guys who they work in a cubicle somewhere. Maybe they went to college, but they didn't really think about what they wanted to do. They get a job someplace that allows them to have enough money to, have an apartment. Maybe they have roommates if they're a young person, but they play video games and consume entertainment. There's no purpose to their life. There's no strategy to their life. So they don't really do anything. They just kind of wander around. And that's because they don't know themselves. They haven't thought about it. They're not introspective. They're not honest with themselves. And the way to avoid that, of course, is to do those things, to be honest with yourself. It's also being a master of yourself. You see that in those lines. Ultimately, you're responsible for you, and therefore you must always be in control of your own destiny. That's a hugely important thing, especially these days. The world in which we're all entering in, and some of us are later along the timeline, of course. Younger people listening to this, you've got a lot longer to go than I do. But it's critical that you control your own destiny because, The structures that we've all been told we should be able to rely upon in society are just falling apart. It's coming undone. And so that means if you're a family man, you have to think, hey, how can I take care of my family? If you have extended family, how am I going to be able to take care of them? How can I make sure I provide for myself? These are the things you have to start thinking about, and coming up with a strategy to say, how do I control my own destiny is vital to that success. You can't do it just by hoping that things work out or going from one thing to the next. You also need to know the nature of others. This is one of those hard things. It does come with age, I think. Whether you're in competition, you're in a partnership, you're in command of people, or you're a subordinate, you really do need to understand the perspective of others. You have to see the world through their eyes and feel what it's like for them to live. Because once you start to do that, particularly in competition, this is one of the things you do learn in sports at a young age. Once you kind of get the sense of this is how this guy's strategy is, like wrestling, for example, when I was a young man, you knew. And you also knew that people were doing that to you, so you would see how they learned you so you could learn them better. Well, this is true in everything in your life. You need to understand everyone's perspective, because once you do that, you get to see yourself on that big chessboard of life and be able to kind of have that understanding of what you do and how other people respond to it. And of course, in our politics, and since it's a political show, I need to talk about that a little bit. Understanding our opponents is a critical thing. We're very poor at this. We don't think about what types of liberals there are, what types of conservatives are. We do a little bit, but we're not really as good at it as we need to be. Acting in your own interest. I mean, that's, this is one of those things that at last one, don't involve yourself in the impractical. This is one, owning the libs is the impractical. It's a waste of time. Don't waste your time on things that don't advance the goals. Again, pointless engagements and doing impractical things and silly things. And that's what this book kind of brings to either business or politics, and that is the focus on, hey, here's our strategy, here's what our reason is to be here, and this is why we're doing those things. The second book is called The Water Book, and this is where Musashi gets into the details of his fighting style and his philosophy of fighting. And again, it's an important thing to keep in mind. His book is almost about two topics at the same time. One is the actual ways in which you fight and you organize yourself as a warrior and different strategies and that sort of thing, but also about how one lives their life. That's really the appeal of the book. It's more than just an instruction manual. It's really about how to live your life as a successful warrior. Now, if you're one of those people who likes to play dress up in armor on weekends and battle other guys in an open field, well, then this is the book for you. This is the one that really you're going to enjoy and sink your teeth into. And look, I actually know a guy who does this. And it's not, he's not just 2 or 3 guys going out on a weekend at a park and beating each other over the head with sticks. There's hundreds of these guys. He belongs to a group, and, they go all over the country. I think they've even gone into Europe where, they kind of have rules about how they go about this stuff. And, they have their essentially homemade armor, and they have rules about what it means to kill someone or knock them down and a whole bunch of other stuff. And, they sword fight with I think they use bamboo sticks. But anyway, if that's what you're into, this is definitely the book for you. Now, the opening section of the book is titled Spiritual Bearing and Strategy. And here's some of that. In strategy, your spiritual bearing must not be any different from normal. Both in fighting and in everyday life, you should be determined though calm. Meet the situation without tenseness, yet not recklessly. Your spirit settled, yet unbiased. Even when your spirit is calm, do not let your body relax. And when your body is relaxed, do not let your spirit slacken. Do not let your spirit be influenced by your body, or your body influenced by your spirit. Be neither insufficiently spirited nor over-spirited. An elevated spirit is weak, and a low spirit is weak. Do not let the enemy see your spirit. Now, this, again, I've talked about this in the previous section. It's a sort of style of writing, this way of kind of juxtaposition of things. Again, if you're into Oriental religions, you're a Buddhist or something, then this is appealing to you. But for a lot of Westerners, it can be a little irritating. But the core lesson here, and I think it comes through, is that you need to stay calm and even-keeled, not just in the heat of the moment, as in the case of, say, a battle, is what he's talking about here, but also in all of your life. And that means you maintain a sober and steady approach in all aspects of your life. Now, look, this is easier said than done, but that's the point of practice and training. Again, anyone who's played sports in their youth, you'll recognize this wisdom. You drill and drill and drill in a deliberate way, so it becomes your nature. when it comes time to execute, it's as natural as anything else. Now, then there's this section that I like. Small people must be completely familiar with the spirit of large people, and large people must be familiar with the spirit of small people. Whatever your size, do not be misled by the reactions of your own body. When your spirit is open and unconstricted, look at things from a high point of view. You must cultivate your wisdom and spirit. Polish your wisdom. Learn public justice. Distinguish between good and evil. Study the ways of different arts one by one. When you cannot be deceived by men, you will have realized the wisdom of strategy. Now, this isn't a book about sword fighting. And you think about that, you say, and you look how it starts, it seems kind of benign, kind of the same old stuff. But really what this is about is that a man of high character that's going to be revealed in the pressure of the moment. And you develop your character and philosophical style so that in the heat of the moment, all these things that are true about you all the time will be true about you in the heat of the moment. Now, you could probably argue that everything you need to know about how to be a man in this world is right there in that paragraph. Once you know who you are, know your purpose in life, the point of your life, and you've committed yourself to it, well, you're beyond deception. And the reason is that we're fooled by others, not because they're crafty or clever, and they certainly can be, but because we don't know ourselves. And that's what the con man, that's what our politicians, and of course what's grifters of various types, that's what they exploit. They exploit that ignorance we have of ourselves. Now, in this chapter, as I said at the start, Musashi gets into the details of how to fight. And he starts out with the warrior's stance. And it finishes with this great line. He goes through all this, sort of mechanics about how you hold your head and your chin is, and how you don't crinkle up your eyes or wrinkle your forehead, all these little details. And then at the end it says, in all forms of strategy, it is necessary to maintain the combat stance in everyday life, and to make your everyday stance your combat stance. You must research this well. Always like that. It's a line that always stuck with me, long ago when I read it. Because in this age, and how I would take it, is that it would mean that your public attitude, the way in which you confront the world, let's say at work, in your day-to-day life, well, it can't really be any different than how you would do it in private. You have to be the same person all the time. You can't turn it on and off. You can't be like one kind of person, say, in your politics. We all feel this sometimes, that we have to kind of hide this stuff, but you really can't. You have to find this balance where so that you're not trying to be one kind of person in your politics, a different person at work, and then a different person in your home life. You have to accept the fact that you've got to be the same guy in all these places all the time, and that means you have to organize your life that way. We have to face all aspects of the world with the same stance. He then gets into various sword techniques like the proper grip and how to attack different parts of the opponent. He explains these different things like slashing and cutting an opponent. And again, if you're really interested in the swordplay stuff, or medieval fighting techniques, well, then this will be interesting. And now I know there's a lot of people who are. There's a guy on, I think Lindy Page, something like that, as a YouTuber, British YouTuber. He gets into all this stuff. They practice with spears and test out different weapons, and it's kind of neat. I don't do it, but I get the attraction. But even if you're not. And this section, stuff is kind of short. It breaks it down, so you can kind of breeze through it. But when you read through this stuff, even if you have very little interest in it, what you see is this completeness, this idea of being well-rounded, knowing all aspects of things. And that really gets back to that overall point that was laid out in the first book, that all the skills and abilities that we master in life must be in furtherance of the strategy of our life. You maintain, these different skills, not because of those skills in particular give you some advantage or useful in some tactic, but they're a part of advancing that overall strategy of your life. And there's a section here about how to maintain your ability to keep perspective while you're in, difficult circumstances when you're in combat. Don't lose the forest from the trees. He puts it as, in strategy, it is important to see distant things as if they were close and to make distant things seem closer. He also has some points about timing and how each tactic is, in each aspect of it, there's a dimensionality to, tactics and skills. And, that's an important thing to always keep in mind, because it's true, just because you can do something well doesn't mean you should always do it well. Now, the main theme of this book, and the reason why this book is called Water, again, is it's about being flexible. And here's a line that I like, I think it sums it up. with water as the basis, the spirit becomes like water. Water adapts the shape of its receptacle and is sometimes a trickle and sometimes a wild sea. And from our personal perspective, this is a point about mastering all skills. You have to have this broad of knowledge as possible, because if you're going to be successful in anything you do in life, whatever you're doing, work or your personal interest, whatever it must be, you have to be prepared to adjust your tactics in order to advance. Louis Pasteur put it as, chance favors the prepared mind. It's a fairly famous quote. And that really is what this book is about. It's about being prepared mentally and spiritually, and of course physically. There's a technical aspect in the narrow sense of being a sword fighter, but it's that preparedness so that you can adapt and be flexible. And of course, this is the most important thing in our politics. Even in the best of times when society is fully functioning, it's completely normal. Political actors, in order to be successful, they're constantly adjusting. They're adapting. They're trying to figure out how to do things to advance whatever they're trying to advance, even if it's just winning an election. And in this age where everything is up in the air all of a sudden, we have to be flexible, and we have to prepare to adapt to whatever fates have in store for us. Which means having a broad understanding of what's happening in the world. We can't keep trying to jam things into an old sensibility, an old way of looking at things, because that old way is gone. I write about this a fair amount, and calling conservatives yesterday men and libertarians yesterday men. But that's an important thing to kind of understand, is that our understanding has to be constantly updated as a part of being flexible. And that's what this book talks about. This book is about, if you're going to be successful, you've got to be flexible. And really what it means is focusing on victory over yourself and your own interests. It sounds kind of strange, but this is the quote that summarizes it. Study strategy over the years and achieve the spirit of a warrior. Today is victory over yourself of yesterday. Tomorrow is victory over lesser men. The third book is called The Fire Book. This book continues, but in greater detail, on the specifics of fighting. That's the sort of the first layer, is the different ways in which to fight. But unlike the Water Book, the Fire Book is more focused on tactics. The Water Book was about mastering a range of skills, understanding what they're used for, so you have a wide range of these things to adapt to various situations. The Fire Book is more focused on the tactics of fighting. And again, if you're into medieval fighting, or for that matter, really modern fighting, the lessons of this book will be of interest, because it's one of those things where there's skills, things that you would learn. Let's say if you're a boxer, there's things, throwing a jab, how to defend yourself in various ways, how to keep your feet in under different circumstances, your footwork in general. These are all skills. Well, they're a part of, and they're rolled up into various tactics that you will use to attack your opponent. But the tactics, though, are in service to an overall strategy. So that's the way to think of these things. So the Water Book was more focused on a wide range of skills and why you need to have them, while the Fire Book is now looking at tactics, and it assumes that you mastered the skills in the previous section. And it's also why you can tell that this book was popular with businessmen in the 1980s, or really anyone in a competitive field. There's lots of good advice in this particular book. The first instruction is, examine your environment. Here's what he says. Stand in the sun. That is, take up an attitude with the sun behind you. If the situation does not allow this, you must try to keep the sun on your right side. In buildings, you must stand with the entrance behind you or to your right. Make sure that your rear is unobstructed and that there is free space on your left, your right side being occupied with your sword attitude. At night, if the enemy can be seen, keep the fire behind you and the entrance to your right, and otherwise take up your attitude as above. You must look down on the enemy and take up your attitude on slightly higher places. Well, this really is ancient wisdom. This is true long before Musashi came around and was sitting in his cave writing this stuff out. This is really a fundamental of all combat, of all types and all places. You always want to make the environment your asset and never engage in any battle where the environment is your enemy. That you don't go and fight on the other guy's turf. You don't give him a natural advantage. That's just pretty obvious. At the Battle of Agincourt, the English were vastly outnumbered by the French, but the terrain was muddy, and it rained for a long time prior to the battle, so the ground was really saturated. And the English, most importantly, they possessed the high ground. So when the French advanced in their heavy armor and their cavalry, they were going uphill in the mud. They were no match for the English longbows, and so the French were slaughtered. This battle has been, talked about and immortalized, really, I think, in Shakespeare's Henry V. I think that's the best way to put it. It's an iconic battle in the English imagination, and it was all possible by this understanding, this basic advice of understand your environment, make your environment an advantage for you. Now, from our perspective, when we're talking about modern day stuff, well, obviously, if you're in a business world, for example, you never want to be in a situation where you're competing against other people for, let's say, products or services when they clearly have a distinct advantage over you. There's no point in you wasting all your energy trying to sell into a marketplace at which you're unqualified. So you don't do that. It's a waste of time. Instead, you want to try and get into markets where you have a distinct advantage, where the marketplace itself is your advantage. Personal life, you obviously want to, if you're in your career, you always want to play to your strengths and always be in places in the kinds of companies that will allow you to play for your strengths. This is pretty basic stuff, I think. But from our perspective in terms of politics, this means never fighting our enemies on ground that's favorable to them. It's why wave after wave of right-wingers have been crushed by liberal media, for example. They insist on going on these platforms that were literally designed to guarantee the defeat of the right-winger. It's all set up. Frankly, one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is the abject idiocy of going into liberal strongholds like the Charlottesville debacle and thinking that, they're going to play by their own rules and allow you to beat them, using their rules against them. That was never going to happen. And not knowing that was why that was a debacle, why it's a disaster, and why there's people in jail, why these lawsuits continue and all the other stuff. If you were going to go into the other person's turf, you needed to find a way to take advantage of this reality, and they didn't bother doing that. Now, Masashi then talks about how to handle an enemy that will be attacking you. And he says, there are 3 methods to forestall the enemy. The first is to forestall him by attacking first. Another method is to forestall him as he attacks. And the other method is when you and the enemy attack together. Now, basically what he means is that if the enemy, he's going to attack. If you go after him first, attack him, obviously you now have the advantage. On the other hand, you can plan for his attack and be prepared for it and then counterattack quickly, thus turning the tables on him. And of course, the worst way is to just rush in together, because that's the most deadly and violent thing to do, is just attack strength to strength. The point being made in this section is that you must always take the lead in any competition, no matter what it is, whether you're in combat or you're playing cards. The whole point of competition is that you want the other side, to be on their back foot. And you understand that the other side is always going to be trying to avoid that by going on the offense. So you have to steal the initiative by gauging their attacks, stopping their attacks, or attacking them first. This is true in every kind of silly children's games to all the way up to actual combat. And this is a vitally important lesson. You see this in boxing. Mike Tyson famously said that all of his opponents had a plan until he hit them. And it was a funny way of putting it, but it was actually true. What he was saying is that the aggressive style, his style of fighting was, a type of attack that put his opponents naturally on the defensive. So whatever plan of attack they might have had, they immediately had to abandon that plan because all of a sudden they're now playing defense, which they didn't plan to do. And of course, that gave them a huge advantage. It was not until Buster Douglas came up with an actual plan of attack that relied on Tyson's aggressive style. And that's why Buster Douglas won. It's a beautiful fight to watch because it's exactly, the use of strategy to turn another man's strength against him. Now, probably my favorite part of the book is this little bit of wisdom about what to do once you have an advantage. And here goes. I'll just go ahead and read it. Everything can collapse. Houses, bodies, and enemies collapse when their rhythm becomes deranged. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy starts to collapse, you must pursue him without letting the chance go. If you fail to take advantage of your enemy's collapse, they may recover. In single combat, the enemy sometimes loses timing and collapses. If you let this opportunity pass, he may recover and not be so negligent thereafter. Fix your eye on your enemy's collapse and chase him, attacking him so that you do not let him recover. You must do this. The chasing attack is with a strong spirit. You must utterly cut the enemy down so that he does not recover his position. You must understand utterly how to cut down your enemy. Not hard to see what he's saying here. As soon as you get the advantage, you have to take advantage and apply it. You have to exploit it, defeat the other guy. That's the whole point of any competition, whether it's politics or playing cards or playing horseshoes in the backyard. And something I've noticed my whole life, and even in sports, I remember seeing this when I was a young guy, is the tendency for people to let off the opponent, to let the opponent off their back. It was the craziest thing. I saw this many times, and I never understood it. And of course, in politics, you see this all the time. Conservatives, they do this instinctively. When they have an advantage, they start yammering about their principles, and they give the game away. In the context of our politics, we saw an example of this with CRT. The accusation that this stuff is anti-white, it caused the bad guys to collapse. They were poleaxed by this because it strips them of their sense of moral authority. It puts them on the defensive, which is why, of course, all the usual suspects swung into action to try and prevent the good guys from cutting down the bad guys. Now, finally, here's another passage that I think is useful. To become the enemy means to think yourself in the enemy's position. In the world, people tend to think of a robber trapped in a house as a fortified enemy. However, if we think of becoming the enemy, we feel that the whole world is against us and that there is no escape. He who is shut inside is a pheasant. He who enters to arrest is a hawk. You must appreciate this. In large-scale strategy, people are always under the impression that the enemy is strong and so tend to become cautious. And this is something you see often in all right-wing politics, and that is this unwillingness to appreciate the mind of the opponent. I've complained about this with the old paleocons, old right-wing people. They always assume the other side is acting rationally, the way in which a conservative would define acting rationally, as in self-interest. Even a lot of people on the dissident side who are completely up to, all the important stuff, they always assume that the bad guys are acting out of self-interest, that they're rational, that there's some, sensible reason for what they're doing. That's always the mistake. We seem to think that if we defeat their rationality, we can defeat them, and it never works that way. We do ourselves no favors by not understanding the minds of our enemies and acting on that understanding. Our side tends to think the other side is full of super smart logic machines that can't be defeated. But that's not true. Everyone can be beaten. The second to last book in the Book of Five Rings is called The Wind Book. Now, most of the information in the previous two books particularly, but really the first three chapters, if you will, or books, it's useful in that it could be applicable today. It was, sure, we're not sword fighting, but, the techniques described and the strategies and the reason why you learn things and all that, it all can easily be applied to the things that we would do today, whether it's in our personal lives, business lives, politics, what have you. Those last two books particularly were concerned with the skills you need and the point of having a broad mastery, and how it's essential to, being adaptive. And also, of course, discuss these things in the context of overall strategy. The point is to defeat the enemy, and so that's why you have all these things, these skills, and of course that's why you want to be adaptive. That was the point. Now, none of us will have a need to fight another man to the death using swords, or at least that seems to be true at the moment, but these lessons really do apply to lots of other things. There's a lot of wisdom in those books about how a man should live his life. Now, this book is primarily concerned with the specific details about other schools that existed at the time. And this really is where it's important to put the Book of Five Rings into context. It was written in the 17th century for an audience of what we should think of as gentlemen warriors. These were men who usually owned land. They had status in society. They came from families that had status. And they were required to fight in groups against other groups of men, on behalf of some lord, as a feudal system. Or, of course, they also fought in single combat. We think of medieval Europe as, knights fighting one another for honor, the damsel in distress, or, because of personal slights. And a lot of that was actually true. A lot of that did go on. A lot of what we think of as, sort of knightly conduct evolved out of these sort of ritualized combat that they went through, with games and things like that. But that was very similar to what was happening in Japan as well. The culture had evolved a complex set of reciprocal relationships within the ruling class, but also between opponents and allies. But belonging to a fighting style was more than just how you learned how to be a soldier or something like that. It really wasn't the same thing. It was a significant part of your life as a gentleman warrior. It kind of defined who you were. And there were a lot of different schools of fighting at the time. there's a term, kenjutsu, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, was sort of the umbrella term that meant all the different schools of Japanese swordsmanship. And each of these schools had their own techniques, their own traditions, they had associated philosophies, and of course, oftentimes they had their own choice of weapons. They specialized in certain types of weapons. And at the peak, there were over 500 of these schools. And if you go and look it up, there's probably, I stopped counting, it looked like about 100 known masters. These were guys who either established a school or were particularly, famous for a particular fighting technique. Because these guys were not just fighters either. They also were trainers. They trained other people. This warrior class in Japan, they weren't just running around fighting each other all the time. These training centers were, a part of the economy. A master would actually have students and he would train them. And that was a way in which he made money. And so this sort of system evolved very similar to what happened in Europe, but obviously, with its own Japanese flair. Now, in this book, he doesn't go through every school by name, although that would have been pretty interesting to do because it's obvious that he had this deep familiarity with all these different styles. But what he did is he goes through it by types of fighting philosophy. He notes that, most schools have some sort of secret strategy or some ancient traditions that they claim are unique to them. But most of these were derivative of other martial arts. All this, these proliferation of schools are really just forks. Somebody started something and then later on some guy kind of takes the approach and slightly adapts it a little bit differently. Their similarities and differences evolved through, situational factors, whether it was adapted to indoor or outdoor fighting or particular times of the year or certain cultural events at the time, that kind of thing. And this is something that was considered important to readers back in the 1980s. This is one of those things that I remember this book, because my copy, I think I was in high school, so it was in the 80s. The idea was that, what this secret knowledge that the Japanese businessmen had because, they were kicking America's ass and all that stuff. If you go back and watch 1980s movies or TV shows, you see this theme comes up a lot about how, Japan is going to take over the world and put all American companies out of business. And one of the takeaways that Americans got from this is that when you went around and did what the Japanese did, which was learn all these different, ways in which to do business, American companies, how they do business, you see that it's a process. These companies did business because they were a part of this long evolutionary process that was rooted in the necessity of their time and place. The Japanese businessmen weren't studying American business to copy it, but to understand its history within the historical context. This provided them with an advantage, at least that was assumed, because they could predict how American business and an American government would react to Japanese competition. And this is obviously something that we should keep in mind in our own lives, particularly when it comes to politics. What we see happening in America, it didn't spring from nothing. All this stuff with critical race theory, for example, this is a long progression, and it should have been predicted. That's a real critique we can make of, say, conservatism, and that these guys supposedly study politics and have this deep understanding of all these traditions and all this stuff, and yet they're always caught flat-footed. They never can predict what the left is going to do. And of course, from our own perspective, we don't want to repeat that mistake. We want to get better at sort of understanding what everybody else is doing. Now, one bit about this book that I always found a bit amusing in it, and that is his admission that he cannot be objective about these other schools he's evaluating. He indicates that his appraisal is going to be one-sided because the only school he ever had any interest in was his because it's right and the rest of these guys are wrong in some way. It's funny, because it's oddly honest. But he admits that without this basic understanding, without studying all these alternatives, you really can't learn his approach, his strategy, because his strategy is dependent upon appreciating what all these other schools are teaching. It really is an interesting bit of candor and honesty about himself, which, from 5 centuries ago or 4 centuries ago, it's interesting to hear it. The broader lesson from this book is that in order to perfect your own strategy, your own way about going, whatever it is, your business strategy, your personal strategy, or politics, whatever it might be, you really have to have a deep understanding of what everyone else is doing and, of course, understanding what your opponents are going to be doing. Now, I think, this book is a little tough, or this part, the Wind book, it's a little boring, it's a little dry, it's short. It's 13 pages, something like that, so you can kind of breeze through it, because we really can't relate to these critiques of various fighting schools. But the book is not without some useful nuggets of wisdom. For example, here's one. Some other schools have a liking for extra long swords. From the point of view of my strategy, these must be seen as weak schools. This is because they do not appreciate the principle of cutting the enemy by any means. Their preference is for the extra long sword, and relying on the virtue of its length, they think they can defeat the enemy from a distance. In this world it is said 1 inch gives the hand advantage, but these are idle words of one who does not know strategy. It shows the inferior strategy of a weak spirit that men should be dependent on the length of their sword, fighting from a distance without the benefit of strategy. I like the wording, because he's very blunt, but what's being said here is that, it's not the tools that make a man. It's the man and his mastery of his tools. That's the difference maker. Whatever edge a weapon or a tool or a strategy or, some skill you have you might think gives you, ultimately it's about how you wield it. And further, if the tool becomes a replacement for courage and skill, then you're only kidding yourself. The fact is, in anything you do in your life, you have to be prepared to get dirty in order to accomplish it. Now, obviously, we're not fighting people to the death, but in any sort of competition, you have to be prepared to do the dirty work that's required to succeed. If you're not prepared to get bloody, well, you're going to accept losing. Now, overall, I think this book is interesting only as a way of understanding the time in which it was written. The basic point about studying and analyzing the alternative styles was a good lesson. I think, it's not, again, it's not going to really resonate with us in the current age. But, understanding how other people compete is a standard part of modern militaries, understanding how other armies fight. It goes back a long way. And it's also useful about our politics, I think, in that knowing how our enemies do their politics means we can predict what they will do and how they'll respond. Trump was a master of this, by the way. This is one of those things that gets forgotten because there's a lot of reasons to complain about Trump, and I understand. I've done a lot of complaining about him myself. But one of the things he was really good at is that he routinely baited the press into doing his bidding because he had a deep understanding of their way of fighting. He knew how they would go after him, how they would jump on things, and he used that to get them to do things he wanted them to do. And one of the reasons he did this is that he was a big fan of this book back in the 1980s. I remember Donald Trump talking about this and some other books. He also wrote his own book, and of course back then he said it was much better than all the other ones. But he was a fan of this book, and he put at least one of the lessons to good use during his 5 years on the national political scene. The final book in the Book of Five Rings is ominously titled The Book of the Void. Now, this is a short book. In fact, it's just one page. It ties up all the previous chapters into an overall sort of philosophical statement. Now, since it's so short, I'm just going to go ahead and read it. So here goes. What is called the spirit of the void is where there is nothing. It is not included in man's knowledge. Of course, the void is nothingness. By knowing things that exist, you can know that which does not exist. That is the void. People in this world look at things mistakenly and think that what they do not understand must be the void. This is not the true void. This is bewilderment. In the way of strategy, those who study as warriors think that whatever they cannot understand in their craft is the void, but this is not the true void. To attain the way of strategy as a warrior, you must study fully other martial arts and not deviate even a little from the way of the warrior. With your spirit settled, accumulate practice day by day and hour by hour. Polish the twofold spirit, heart, and mind, and sharpen the twofold gaze, perception, and sight. When your spirit is not in the least clouded, when the clouds of bewilderment clear away, there is the true void. Until you realize the true way, whether in Buddhism or in common sense, you may think that things are correct and in order. However, if we look at things objectively, from the viewpoint of laws of the world, we see various doctrines departing from the true way. Know well this spirit, and with forthrightness as the foundation of the true spirit as the way. Enact strategy broadly, correctly, and openly. Then you will come to think of things in a wide sense, and taking the void as the way, you will see the way as the void. In the void is virtue, and no evil. Wisdom has existence. Principle has existence. The way has existence. Spirit is nothingness. Now, that seems rather esoteric and very Eastern and mystical and all that stuff. And you have to understand, when you read this whole book, I think an important thing to understand is that there were stylistic things. There was certainly a very Japanese way of phrasing things and framing things. So, you have to take that into consideration. And we're also working from translations. My translation is one of the better ones, from what I understand. And it goes back a long way. But, whenever you're translating from one language to another, particularly over almost 500 years of time, some things will be lost. And I mean, even someone who is a master of the language might struggle with some of the concepts. So you have to keep this stuff in mind when you read it. Now, putting that aside, what he's trying to emphasize here is that you must learn to perceive that which you cannot understand and comprehend. And this is something that we kind of know about in our age. We understand these things, particularly in the West, that there are things that are beyond just what we can, our senses can communicate to us, feel and taste and smell and so forth. There are things we can understand, we just kind of intuitively understand. Christianity is fundamentally based on this. If you walk into, say, an Eastern Orthodox church in Eastern Europe, you can see that the design of the church, the decorations, all the things are there to sort of foster that in the mind, this sense of knowing things that are not visible, knowing things that are not there but they are there, that sort of thing. So we can understand this, I think. But what he's really saying is that you're only going to understand that which is not plainly obvious as you master the skills, and that's true of being a swordsman or being a warrior or just living as your life as a person. It's not just about this book. It's not just about being a great warrior, but it's having a true understanding of the world and your place in it. His fundamental argument is that you can't be a great warrior unless you have this firm understanding of the nature of the world and your place in the world. And once you reach that point, the things that are invisible to most people will become obvious and natural to you. Think of it this way. The master cabinet maker, some guy who makes cabinets, he's high-end stuff, really complicated stuff. He spends his life working with all sorts of woods and all sorts of types of cabinets to make and all kinds of ways in which to make them. He's mastered every tool that a cabinet maker could ever use in his craft. He knows the tools. He knows everything about what kind of cabinets you can make out of different kinds of woods, all that kind of stuff. So through years of work at his craft, he begins to know things about the wood that he really has no way of explaining, how it will respond and what kind of techniques it can be used on it. If you ask him, why one technique would work while another would not, he might not be able to answer you because he just knows. This comes from a long time working with in his craft, mastering it completely. It becomes second nature. If you've ever been around a true craftsman, and I'm using a cabinet maker on purpose because I'm actually thinking of somebody who is like this. It's an amazing thing. You ask them a question, and they will look at you, and they almost have to interpret it. It's almost like they're interpreting their knowledge into English from some other language, and that other language is this secret language, this secret knowledge that they've acquired over time. It's a phenomenal thing to experience when you're thinking about it. You're aware of this because you can tell they're struggling with, how do I communicate something to someone that I just know? Another good example is a great athlete. It's a little bit cruder example, but I think it works just as well. They call it muscle memory, but muscles don't have memories. It's the mind that controls the muscles. Elite athletes in the prime of their career, they've mastered their body in the context of their sport, of course, to the point where their actions, they require no thinking. There's no saying, I'm going to do this. It's just second nature. That great player, they say, is in the zone, meaning he no longer has any thinking about what he's doing on the field or the court or whatever the situation might be. He's just doing it without any thought, as if it's automatic. It's his nature, like a tree growing. Now, this comes from mastering all the skills, but also the techniques and strategies that are used in the sport. It's why the great athletes are often at their peak near the end of their physical peak. At that point, they know just about everything they need to know or could possibly know about their sport. And they also are at the physical peak so they can execute these things. It's why they tend to hit that peak and then all of a sudden they start getting worse kind of quickly. It's not just the physical side necessarily. It's that the physical side can no longer execute the mental side. Now, the line that I think best applies to us today is this one. Until you realize the true way, whether in Buddhism or in common sense, you may think that things are correct and in order. However, if you look at things objectively from the viewpoint of the laws of the world, we see various doctrines departing from the true way. Note that objectivity here means outside yourself. You see the world as it is, including your place in it, and that extends to your actions in the world. And this is a really important thing, I think, because a lot of times when we're selfish in how we look at the world, we judge things and we look at the world in which we find ourselves only in relation to what we want or what we hope for, that kind of thing. It reminds me of something that Oswald Spengler said, and that is, optimism is for cowards. But so is pessimism. Both are ways to avoid seeing the world as it is, and they both allow you to avoid facing up to the realities of your place in the world. That guy who thinks that things will just work out, well, what he's really doing is trying to avoid the unpleasant realities of the present rather than address it. You see this a lot with, for example, the tech censorship. That's a good example. A lot of these libertarian types who are really fond of the sidelines said, oh, well, the marketplace will solve this. Other companies will grow up and that'll take care of the problem. Well, what they were doing is avoiding the reality of the situation. They were embracing sunny optimism as a way, really as a form of escapism. And the same holds for pessimists. The pessimist is really just looking for company on the sidelines of life because he lacks the heart to get into the action. So what he's trying to do is convince you that there's no hope. So join him on the sidelines so you can kind of enjoy sinking into the abyss together. And this is ultimately the point of the book. And by the book, I mean the entire book, the Book of Five Rings. On the surface, it's about a particular style of sword fighting and all the skills that are involved, that would make you a good, swordsman in medieval Japan. But in reality, it is about how one lives their life as a complete man, a complete person. You can only do that by executing the strategy of your life. And that means learning all the skills and techniques that are required of that strategy of your life. But most important is committing yourself fully to it in all aspects of your life. You can't be one thing at one time, then a different thing at another time, and have all these different facets to your personality. People tend to think that makes you interesting. And when in fact, really, it's just escapism. It avoids, having to embrace the fullness of your life and your place in this world. And this is something that I think we all kind of know at a certain level. If you ever played sports again, I like to use sports analogies in this book because I think it applies a lot. That practice always reveals itself on the field, the court, the mat, the ring, wherever it is. If you've practiced hard, it shows up in the competition. The great athlete is a great athlete when he's watching TV, when he's doing laundry. He's always a great athlete. And that's true of anyone who's good at anything, who tries to maximize the time he has in this world. He's always doing those things. He's always aiming towards fulfilling the strategy of his life. And this really is the ultimate lesson of the Book of Five Rings. To be a warrior of Musashi's school means to live that life in everything you do. You master it by immersing yourself in it to the point where you and it are the same. And this is true today as it was 500 years ago. Well, I hope that was as much fun for you as it was for me. I really did enjoy putting the show together this week. It's funny, I haven't actually touched this book, 10 years, 15 years, it's hard to know. Probably about 10 years. Every once in a while, it's on the shelf and I'm moving stuff around, I'll pick it up, so who knows. But it's one of those books that I think, at least for me, it was the first book that really kind of got my mind thinking that there's bigger stuff out there, to kind of think more broadly. At that point, I hadn't had a lot of exposure to Japanese writing or Japanese philosophy or any of those sorts of things. And so it seemed extremely foreign to me and very opaque. It was really difficult to read the first time through. I didn't really understand any of it. But in later years, as I got older, of course, I started to experience the world more and understand things a little bit better. And now coming to it as in the back half of my life, it's an interesting experience to have gone through, to kind of read the whole thing through. And it's not a really long book. You can read it in one sitting. And it's just interesting, though, from my perspective, having experienced it at multiple points in my life and how different parts of it resonate. So maybe this show is one of those times where it was more fun for me to do than for people to listen to, but who knows? I'm trying to stay away from the hardcore politics a little bit. I mean, the writing is what it is, but with the show, I think, it's summertime and, sometimes you just need to kind of take a break from the hardcore political stuff. So, I'm going to do some of this stuff, do some weird things. So I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Anyway, I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and I will be back next week.